Spookie Place.
The headmaster's office. Ravenshade High was never a place you'd call normal. You could feel it in the air. The heaviness that hung around the school like a constant storm cloud, just waiting to burst. The tall, old brick building, with its ivy-clad walls and cobblestone pathways, seemed to have a history all its own, one that no one ever dared to talk about in detail. There were rumors, of course. Everyone had heard them. The stories about the headmaster, Mr. Wilfred Thorne, and the strange things that happened behind closed doors at Ravenshade. But they were just rumors, right? I thought so too. I had been a model student at Ravenshade High, an overachiever, one of the top performers in every class. I was determined, focused, and completely uninterested in things like supernatural folklore. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses. The dark hallways and empty classrooms didn't bother me. They were just part of the atmosphere of an old, crumbling school, nothing more. But the truth is, I never really understood how much more there was to Ravenshade until that one night. It started with a letter, the kind of letter you don't expect to receive at all, sealed with dark wax and bearing no return address. I had just finished my late-night study session when I found it lying on the doorstep of my dorm room. I hadn't heard anyone knocking, hadn't seen anyone leave it. It was just there. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the smooth, cool surface of the envelope. There was something off about it. A strange feeling washed over me as I broke the seal. Inside was a simple piece of heavy, cream-colored paper with only a few lines written in bold, precise handwriting. To the top students of Ravenshade High, a special assignment awaits. Meet me in the hall at midnight. Mr. Wilfred Thorne. I stared at it for a long time. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke, a prank perhaps from one of my classmates trying to spook me. But then I remembered something my best friend had said to me weeks ago, something I'd brushed off as just another rumor. The headmaster's a little different. They say he tests people, especially the ones who get too curious. Be careful if you ever get one of his invitations. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I mean, who would? This was Ravenshade High, after all. But the invitation in my hand now felt more real than anything else. My heart skipped a beat. Should I go? Was it a test? A game? I wasn't one to shy away from challenges. If anything, I thrived on them. I had always been a top student, and I wasn't about to let some weird letter scare me off. I shrugged off my unease, chalking it up to nerves. Maybe it was a secret school project, something important. So, at exactly midnight, I stood outside the tall, imposing gates of Ravenshade High, feeling the wind tug at my jacket. The school had an eerie presence at night, as if the building itself was alive, breathing in the dark silence that surrounded it. I could see the faint glow of a few lights inside, but the place was mostly deserted, empty, just the way I liked it. I wasn't alone. A few other students stood there with me, most of them looking just as nervous as I felt. Some of them I recognized, classmates I had seen in the halls and classrooms. All of us high achievers who had never been one to shy away from a challenge. But we were all quiet, exchanging glances, unsure of what was about to happen. We were here because we had been selected. We were chosen. The door to the main hall creaked open, and out stepped Mr. Wilfred Thorne. The headmaster was taller than I remembered, and his appearance seemed more unsettling in the moonlight. His sharp, angular features and piercing dark eyes that always seemed to be watching you, studying you. His smile didn't seem to reach his eyes. It was cold, like he was constantly playing some sort of game that none of us were aware of. "Welcome," he said softly, his voice low, almost hypnotic. "I see you've all made it." He gave each of us a brief, calculating look before turning and motioning for us to follow him. The hallway was darker than I'd ever seen it, the dim lights flickering overhead. We walked in silence, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The further we went, the more I began to feel the weight of the school press down on me. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew colder with every step. My breath turned to fog in front of me, and I could feel a knot tighten in my stomach. It was as if something in the building was waiting. We arrived at the door to Mr. Thorne's office, a door that had been locked since anyone could remember. I'd never been inside. None of us had. It was an area of the school that was strictly off limits, and yet here we were, about to cross its threshold. The door creaked open, and we stepped inside. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a headmaster's office, but there was something different about it. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books, strange artifacts, and bizarre trinkets that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The faint smell of dust and something else, something faintly metallic, hung in the air. At the center of the room was a large, wooden chair, almost too imposing for a simple office. But what made my stomach lurch wasn't the chair itself. It was the restraints. Iron shackles, bolted to the arms and legs, were fastened tightly to the wood. I stared at them, my pulse quickening. The chair looked like it had been built for something more than just sitting. It looked like it had been built for something else. I turned to Mr. Thorne, but he had already begun to speak. "This is where you will face your test," he said, his voice oddly calm, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "The only question is, will you survive it?" The words hung in the air, and the reality of the situation began to hit me. This was no normal test. I had made a terrible mistake by coming here, and it was too late to turn back. My heart hammered in my chest as Mr. Thorne motioned for me to take my seat in the chair. The heavy weight of his gaze pressed down on me like an invisible force. His pale face never faltered, his eyes never left mine, and the air grew colder still. My mind screamed at me to resist, but my body moved without consent, stepping toward that dreaded chair as though it was pulling me in with some unseen force. The restraints clicked open with an ominous screech, and before I could even think to run, I was seated. The cold metal clamped down on my wrists and ankles with an almost mechanical precision. I could feel the chills seeping through my skin, my bones growing heavy and stiff under the iron hold. The other students stood behind me, their faces pale with fear, though none of them spoke. Some of them were shaking, others had their eyes closed, as if bracing themselves for the inevitable. Mr. Thorne's presence loomed over all of us like a dark shadow, and I could feel a tightening knot in my stomach. The room was getting colder, colder than anything I'd ever experienced. It was as if the very air itself was turning against us. I glanced around at the others, but I couldn't make sense of their expressions. They looked almost like statues. Their eyes were blank, glazed over, as if they were no longer in control of their own thoughts. Some of them even seemed to be breathing in shallow, uneven gasps, like they were fighting to stay conscious, to remain tethered to reality. Suddenly, Mr. Thorne's voice broke the silence, deep and soothing yet dripping with a sense of menace. "You will not escape, Clara," he whispered, as though the words were meant just for me. "Not this time. You asked for this. You are here because you wanted to know. You wanted to see behind the veil." I tried to speak, to ask what he meant, but my throat felt like it was filled with gravel. The words wouldn't come. Panic clawed at me, rising like a tidal wave. This wasn't a test. This was something else, something far darker than I had imagined. Then the room began to shift. At first it was subtle, a flicker of movement in the shadows. The corners of the room seemed to bend, stretching like the shadows themselves were alive. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I could hear the creak of the floorboards beneath me, but it was distorted, wrong, somehow. My eyes darted to the others, but they were all eerily still, completely still. And then it hit me. I wasn't in the headmaster's office anymore. The change came gradually at first, like waking from a dream. The familiar space, the wooden desk, the shelves lined with ancient books, seemed to dissolve, and the floor beneath me no longer felt solid. It became soft and uneven, as though I was floating on a layer of fog. I could no longer hear the clock ticking, the sounds of breathing from the other students. The air turned thick, dense, and suffocating, and I felt my chest tighten with every breath I took. The darkness enveloped me. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. The air itself felt suffocating, clinging to my skin like cobwebs. The temperature plummeted so quickly that I could see my breath swirling before me, forming icy tendrils in the still air. My teeth began to chatter from the cold, but I couldn't stop myself from shivering, from feeling that creeping, suffocating dread deep within my bones. And then, the voices began. They were soft at first, whispers barely audible, like the faintest rustling of paper. My name, Clara, Clara. But as they grew louder, I could hear their tones shift from innocent curiosity to something more insistent, almost demanding. The words echoed around me, bouncing off the walls, coming from everywhere at once. Clara, the voices murmured, you shouldn't be here. You weren't meant to see this. You weren't meant to know. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The whispers weren't just in my ears. They were inside my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. They felt like hands unseen, but real, gripping my brain and twisting my thoughts into something darker, more sinister. You wanted to know, but you can never leave now. Suddenly, the floor beneath me cracked, splitting open with a horrible groan. A deep, dark abyss yawned wide, stretching endlessly beneath me like an endless chasm. I could feel it, its darkness pulling at me, trying to drag me down into its depths. The weight of it was unbearable. The sensation of falling, of being pulled into something beyond comprehension, tightened around my chest like an iron grip. I tried to move, to break free, but I was paralyzed. The restraints, which had once felt cold but manageable, now felt like they were sinking into my skin, their weight heavier than ever before. The shackles dug deeper into my wrists, and I could feel the blood rushing to my head. My limbs were numb, but the cold, unnatural cold seeped into every part of my being. And then, through the darkness, I saw him, Mr. Thorne, but not as I remembered him. He stood before me, but his appearance had shifted. His eyes were black, deep, endless voids that seemed to pull everything in. His face was pale, almost ghostly, stretched in a grotesque smile that seemed far too wide, far too unnatural. He stepped closer, his shadow spreading like ink in the dimness. You think this is a test? He asked, his voice low and hypnotic. You think I brought you here for education? No. This is the price for your curiosity, Clara. This is what happens to those who think they can uncover what's hidden in Ravenshade High. I tried to speak, tried to protest, but the words caught in my throat. I was trapped, and I knew, deep down, that I wasn't in control of my body anymore. You will learn what Ravenshade truly is, Mr. Thorne continued, his voice laced with cruel amusement. And then you will become one with it, just like the others. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, the pressure of their voices overwhelming. It was as if the very walls of this nightmare world were closing in on me. The shadows stretched and writhed, forming shapes, twisted, contorted figures that seemed to stare at me from all angles. I could hear them moving, scratching at the walls, clawing toward me. In that moment, I realized that the others weren't simply gone. They were here all around me. They had been trapped, just like me, just like the students before us. And now, it was my turn to join them. Don't worry, Clara, Mr. Thorne whispered as he crouched beside me. His breath was cold against my ear, sending a shiver down my spine. You'll fit in just fine. I felt the restraints tighten one last time, as if to seal my fate. And then, everything went black. I woke to darkness. At first, I thought it was a dream, some twisted nightmare from which I'd soon awaken. The shadows around me felt thick, oppressive, like they were closing in on me from all sides. But as my senses began to sharpen, I realized the truth. I wasn't in my bed. I wasn't in my room. I wasn't anywhere familiar. The cold was suffocating. I could feel it seeping through my clothes, wrapping around my bones like ice. Every part of me ached, as though I had been lying still for too long. My limbs were heavy, stiff. I tried to move, but the restraints were back, clamped tightly around my wrists and ankles. The iron dug into my skin, and I winced in pain. I was back in that same chair. The chair. A low, guttural sound echoed in the distance, a rasping breath that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to focus, to make sense of where I was, but the darkness was absolute, thick, inescapable. It felt like I was floating in the void. The air itself seemed alive, pressing in on me from all sides, pushing me down. I wasn't alone. I could hear them, the whispers. They were faint at first, just echoes, but as they grew louder, they were unmistakable. Voices, countless voices speaking all at once. Clara, Clara, Clara. My pulse quickened. The voices weren't coming from the walls anymore. They were coming from inside my head, swirling around me like a storm. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block them out, but it was impossible. The pressure, the weight of their words, was crushing me. You can't escape. You'll never leave. Not now. Not ever. I gasped for air, but the cold pressed harder, making it difficult to breathe. My chest constricted. The world was spinning. I couldn't tell if the voices were real, if the room was real, or if I had finally gone mad. I was trapped, lost in this abyss, a prisoner in a nightmare of my own making. I wanted to know. I had wanted to uncover the secrets of Ravenshade High, but now it was too late. Suddenly, the darkness began to shift. The shadows writhed and twisted, pulling themselves into shapes, and I could see the figures emerging from the void. The others, the students who had come before me, the ones who had faced the same fate. Their bodies were there, but their eyes were hollow, vacant, empty. They were no longer human, not entirely. They were part of the darkness now. Their eyes locked onto mine, their gazes empty and cold. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. One by one, they began to move toward me, their footsteps echoing in the void, until they were standing in front of me, silent, still, like statues frozen in time. They didn't speak, but their presence was enough. I could feel them all around me, suffocating me with their silence. Then, from the darkness, I saw him again. Mr. Thorne. He was different now. His form seemed to ripple and twist, like he was part of the shadows themselves. His face was no longer just a face. It was a mask, a grotesque, shifting expression that seemed to change with every blink of my eyes. The cold smile on his lips was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. You're finally understanding, aren't you? He said softly, his voice calm but filled with an unbearable weight. This place doesn't let go. Not of you. Not of anyone. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me like a dark cloud. His hand reached out, fingers long and skeletal, and I felt them brush against my skin, cold, like the grave. You were chosen, Clara. Chosen because you sought the truth, but you didn't understand what that meant. You think you're the first to challenge me? The first to step into this place and expect to leave with your mind intact. He let out a low, mocking laugh, the sound echoing through the void. You think you're special? No one leaves Ravenshade High. Not truly. We are all bound here. Forever. I try to break free, try to rip the restraints off, but it was pointless. The cold, unyielding grip of the restraints tightened, locking me into place. I could feel the darkness pressing against me from all sides, growing stronger, more intense, until it felt like I was being smothered by it. And then I saw them again, the others. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, a sickly, pale light. They were moving now, their bodies jerking unnaturally as they shuffled forward. They reached for me, their hands like claws, their fingers long and twisted. I could hear their raspy, inhuman breaths as they closed in. "You're one of us now," they whispered, their voices a chorus of despair. "You'll never leave. You'll never escape. Not while Ravenshade lives." Terror surged through me as I realized the truth. The test had never been about survival. It had never been about me proving myself. It was about trapping me here, trapping all of us one by one. We were never meant to leave. We were all just part of Ravenshade's eternal cycle. And now, I was just like them. I felt my mind begin to unravel, the whispers overwhelming me, drowning me in their endless chant. The shadows closed in completely, swallowing the last remnants of light and leaving me in total darkness. Mr. Thorne's voice, now closer than ever, echoed in my mind. "Welcome to Ravenshade, Clara. Welcome to the eternal test." The last thing I felt was the cold, the suffocating, all-encompassing cold, and then everything went silent. The ghostly choir. I'd heard the rumors for years. Whispers in the halls, hushed conversations among students, and the quiet warnings from the older locals. Wilkins High School wasn't just any high school. It was different. Everyone in town knew about it, but no one dared talk about it openly. People would just say, "Don't go near the old music room," or "Stay away from the school after dark." And when they did speak of the place, it wasn't with the usual disdain of a rundown institution. No, this was different. The fear was palpable, deep, and old. The stories all had one thing in common: a choir of children, a group of innocent faces who had once filled the halls with their music, their laughter, and their songs. But something had gone terribly wrong. One evening, without explanation, they disappeared, vanishing without a trace. Ever since that night, it was said that their voices lingered in the school, trapped within the walls, haunting anyone who dared to listen. Most dismissed it as nothing more than a story, a local legend designed to scare newcomers. After all, ghost stories weren't anything new to me. I'd grown up on tales of haunted houses, cursed objects, and restless spirits. It was just something people told themselves to add some spice to an otherwise mundane life. But when I transferred to Wilkins High for my senior year, something in my gut told me this place was different. The rumors about the choir, about the voices that came from nowhere, didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. The first day was a blur. I met some of the students, most of whom were distant, almost as if they had shut themselves off from the world. The teachers were equally cold. Some even looked over their shoulders as if making sure no one was eavesdropping before they'd speak. And there was something about the building itself, something about the air, that felt heavy, oppressive. I remember the first time I heard the hum. I was sitting in the library, trying to get a jump on a project, when the silence began to feel wrong. The clocks ticking too loudly, the rustling of papers too sharp. It felt like the air was vibrating with something I couldn't quite place. That's when I heard it, a soft hum. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an old pipe somewhere in the building groaning under the weight of time. But as the sound grew louder, it started to shift. It wasn't just a random noise anymore. It was a melody, a tune so sweet and so clear. It was like it was coming from all around me. I froze in my seat, heart hammering in my chest. I had heard stories about the choir, of course, but I had never taken them seriously. Now, though, the melody was undeniable. It was as though the air itself was alive, whispering something just out of reach. I should have ignored it, gone back to my work, but the sound was so beautiful, so intoxicating. I found myself standing up and heading toward the source. I was curious, perhaps too curious, but something about that hum, that melody, didn't sit right with me. It was pulling me in, and I knew deep down that I was about to cross a line. one that I might never be able to uncross. The hum continued to grow louder, almost as if it was drawing me in, beckoning me closer. I couldn't explain why I felt so compelled to follow it. I had always prided myself on being a logical person, skeptical of ghost stories and supernatural tales. But there was something about the sound that was irresistible, something that made my heart race with both fear and fascination. I found myself walking out of the library, each step heavier than the last, as if the school itself was starting to press down on me. The noise was coming from further down the hallway, near the old music room, a place that had been locked up for years. It was said to be haunted by the ghosts of the children who had once performed there. I'd seen the room from the outside. It was a towering, Gothic structure at the end of a forgotten corridor, the windows cracked, the door hanging ajar. As I made my way down the dark, quiet hall, the air grew colder. I could feel it, like a chill creeping down my spine, as if the temperature dropped the closer I got to the source of the sound. The hum had now transformed into a soft melody, gentle and sorrowful, yet so compelling. It tugged at something deep inside me, an emotion I couldn't quite name. Hope? Longing? When I reached the music room's door, I hesitated. My breath quickened, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. For a moment, I considered turning back. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but that melody was too much to resist. It felt like it had found me, like I was meant to be there. I pushed the door open with a creak, and a rush of cold air blasted my face. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the flickering overhead bulbs. I squinted into the shadows, and then I saw them. The choir. At first, I thought I was seeing things, my mind playing tricks in the low light. But there they were, children standing in perfect rows, as still as statues. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were empty voids, black as night, reflecting nothing but darkness. They were dressed in old, tattered school uniforms, as if frozen in time, and their voices, they were beautiful, too beautiful, singing in perfect harmony, but the tone was wrong, like the melody was something that shouldn't have been heard by the living. It was haunting, soothing, and terrifying all at once. Each note seemed to crawl under my skin, wrapping itself around my chest, squeezing the breath out of me. The sound vibrated through my bones, like it was trying to reach deeper than my body, into my very soul. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I stood frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from them. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching around the children as if they were alive. Then, one of them, the one standing at the front of the group, turned its head toward me. The movement was so unnatural, like it wasn't a simple gesture, but a slow, deliberate action measuring me. Its eyes were black, empty pools, staring straight into my soul. It smiled, a slow, twisted grin spread across its face, and its lips parted to speak. "Join us," it whispered, the voice sweet but carrying an unbearable weight. It was as if the words themselves demanded to be heard, a command to my very core. The room grew even colder. I could see my breath misting in front of me, but the air felt thick, heavy, and suffocating. The other children didn't move, but their gaze was now fixed on me. Every single one of them, their eyes burning with intensity. I wanted to run. My legs felt like lead, my chest tightening, but the pull of their voices, that haunting song, kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't tear myself away. I took a shaky step back, then another, but before I could turn around, the music stopped. Silence. The quiet was deafening, and just like that, in a flash, they were gone. The choir vanished as if they had never been there, leaving only the faintest echo of their song lingering in the air, like a whisper that refused to be silenced. I stood alone in the middle of the room, the cold now even more suffocating, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The walls seemed to close in, and I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat thumping in my ears as I stumbled backward out of the room. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, never looking back, but the echo of their voices, that song, followed me, reverberating in my head. It was as though their presence was attached to me now, like I had crossed some invisible line and was never going to escape. My breath was ragged as I stumbled through the school's empty hallways, my feet barely keeping pace with my frantic thoughts. The silence was deafening, but there was something more terrifying. The echo of their voices, that haunting melody, still reverberated in my mind. It felt as though the sound had lodged itself deep inside, like a persistent whisper that wouldn't stop. I thought I had escaped them. I thought I was free. But the longer I ran, the clearer it became. The sound didn't fade. It followed me. Every corner I turned, every step I took, the melody seemed to grow louder, as if the walls themselves were alive, carrying the song in a way that was impossible to escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that the choir was still there, still watching me, even though I couldn't see them anymore. I made it to the front doors of Wilkins High, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the handle. It was locked. Panic surged through me. The doors were always unlocked. What was happening? I pulled and tugged, desperately trying to get out, but the more I fought, the more the doors refused to open. It was as though the school itself was keeping me inside, trapping me with the very thing I had been trying to escape. I stepped back, fear rising in my throat, and turned around to face the hallway behind me. The darkness felt deeper now, colder. I could feel something watching me, waiting for me to turn, and when I did, there it was. The school had transformed. The walls that had once been covered in faded posters and lockers now seemed old, decayed, as though time had swallowed the building whole. The flickering lights were gone, replaced with an eerie glow that gave the place an unsettling, otherworldly aura. The air was thick and suffocating, as if I were underwater. And then I heard it, the melody again. But this time, it wasn't distant. This time, it was right in front of me. The choir was there again, standing in the middle of the hallway, as if they had been waiting for me. Their faces, those cold, hollow eyes, locked onto me, and the music swirled around me like a vortex. They weren't just singing anymore. They were calling. Their voices reached deep into me, like a magnetic pull, wrapping around my chest and squeezing, as if they were pulling me closer with every note. I couldn't run. My feet wouldn't move. My body wouldn't obey me. I was rooted to the spot, my body growing heavier, my chest tighter with each passing second. Then, one of the children, the leader of the choir, stepped forward, its eyes widening as it tilted its head. The air seemed to crackle around it. "Join us," it whispered again. The words were no longer a simple command. This time, it was an invitation, a binding spell. The voice carried weight. It was like it was reaching beyond the physical world, pulling at something far deeper, something I couldn't comprehend. I felt my body twitch, my limbs moving as if they had a mind of their own. I was being drawn toward them. I could feel my feet moving against my will, my hands reaching out, desperate to hold on to something, anything to stop from getting closer. But it was no use. The pull of the song was stronger. I was losing myself. Suddenly, I understood. This wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't just a story. This choir wasn't a group of lost souls trying to be heard. No, they were trying to replace me. They wanted me to become a part of them, to join their ranks and sing forever, trapped in the music, never allowed to leave. Just as I was about to give in, about to be consumed by their song, a voice broke through the fog. "Run." I don't know where it came from. Maybe it was my own voice. Maybe it was the voice of some long-forgotten student who had escaped their grasp. But whatever it was enough to break the hold. With everything I had left, I forced myself to turn, pushing against the invisible chains that had wrapped themselves around me. The choir's voices grew louder. The air grew colder, but I didn't stop. I ran, each step more desperate than the last. Finally, I reached the exit again, the doors now mysteriously open, as if the school had decided to let me go, for now. I stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. The school loomed behind me, its dark silhouette standing stark against the night sky. The echo of the choir's voices still lingered in my mind, but I was outside. I was free, or so I thought. That night, I swore I'd never return to Wilkins High. I tried to forget what I'd heard, what I'd felt, what I'd seen, but I couldn't. Every night since that moment, I hear their song, not loud, not clear, but always there in the distance, just on the edge of my hearing. It's a lullaby now, something soft and inviting, almost comforting. But I know better. I know they're still waiting for me, still calling me, and I can't shake the feeling that one day they'll come for me again. I don't think I'll ever escape the ghostly choir. The cursed classroom. I've been hearing the rumors about room 304 for weeks, but I never paid them much attention. You know how high school is. There's always some new story, some new urban legend floating around, meant to spook the freshmen. But this one felt different. It wasn't just some tale passed around in whispers during lunch breaks. No, this story had history. It had layers, and it seemed like no one who spoke of it had ever been quite the same. It all started when I overheard a conversation between two seniors in the hallway. Their voices were low, almost as if they didn't want anyone to hear, but I was close enough to catch the words. "Are you really going to try it?" one of them asked. "I don't know. I hear if you go in there after dark, you can still hear them. You know, the ones who disappeared." I wasn't sure what they were talking about, but I overheard enough to know it had something to do with room 304, a classroom that had been locked and abandoned for years. At first, I thought it was just a joke, the kind of ghost story kids tell around a campfire to make each other nervous. But the more I heard, the more I realized that something had happened in that room. According to the stories, the room had once been a bustling classroom full of students. But one day, out of nowhere, everything changed. A group of students who were working late in room 304 had mysteriously vanished without a trace. No one knew where they went. Their belongings were left behind: bags, notebooks, even half-completed assignments. And yet, when the teacher returned, there was no sign of the students. What happened to them? No one knew. The school just chalked it up as some kind of accident or mass disappearance. But the rumors told a darker tale. They said that the students who vanished had never left the room. Not really. They said that something about that place had kept them there, even after they were gone, trapping their souls. What was even stranger was that the teachers never talked about it. Whenever anyone brought up room 304, they changed the subject quickly and uncomfortably. Some even refused to walk down the hall to the classroom. A few had even left the school altogether, never to return. The administrators eventually sealed the room off, but not before a few more students dared to sneak inside, drawn by the stories. None of them ever came back the same. Some were fine at first, but soon they started showing signs of mental strain, jumping at shadows, talking about hearing whispers when no one was around. Others began acting as if they were sleepwalking, speaking in voices that weren't their own. I couldn't resist. I had to know what was inside room 304. That's when I got the idea. I gathered a few friends, told them about what I'd learned, and asked if they wanted to see the classroom for themselves. At first, they were hesitant, the fear of the unknown creeping into their expressions. But curiosity won out. After all, we were in high school. What's scarier than the thought of being trapped in a dull lecture with the teacher's drone of boring facts and formulas? Surely ghosts and curses couldn't be real, right? But I was wrong. As we made our way toward the end of the hallway that led to room 304, the air grew colder. There was something unsettling about the silence in the school, even though it was still early in the evening. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows against the peeling walls. The closer we got to the room, the heavier the air seemed to grow, like we were being pulled into something we weren't meant to understand. I could feel it in my chest, a growing sense of unease, but I kept walking. After all, it was just a classroom, right? But when we reached room 304, standing before the ancient door, the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. It felt as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a move. And I swear, I heard something, a whisper, almost like a soft sigh, but I shook it off as the wind. We were about to open the door, and that's when I realized I had made the biggest mistake of my life. The door to room 304 creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The sound seemed to echo down the hallway, a stark contrast to the stillness of the school. I half expected someone to jump out and stop us, but the hallway remained silent. The dim light from the hallway filtered in through the cracked door, casting long shadows that made the room look even more eerie. It was like stepping into a time capsule, frozen in time, untouched, and forgotten by everyone except the roomers. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. It was freezing inside the room. A thick chill hung in the air, heavier than anything I'd felt before. As soon as I stepped inside, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The room was dusty, the desks and chairs left in disarray. But it wasn't the mess that unsettled me. It was the silence, complete and oppressive. No echo of footsteps, no faint sound of breathing, just a deafening quiet that seemed to press down on me from all directions. I stepped further in, my breath visible in front of me like a mist, a sign of how cold it was. I looked around at the walls, covered in peeling posters and yellowed papers that looked like they had been left there for decades. And then I saw it, the chalkboard. The chalkboard had a dark, jagged line written on it, like someone had scraped the surface with their fingernails. I stepped closer, my heartbeat quickening. The words were simple but chilling. Help US. The letters were large and uneven, like they had been written in a hurry, almost desperate. I could feel the room growing heavier around me, the air thicker, as though something alive had been waiting to make its presence known. My friends were still behind me, reluctant but curious. Lacey had stepped forward too, her voice barely above a whisper. That wasn't there before. Was it? She asked, her voice trembling. I swallowed, tried to steady my nerves. No, it definitely wasn't. Then a sound, a faint, creeping whisper. It was hard to make out at first, like a voice carried on the wind. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. A soft murmur, just beneath the surface of the silence. A voice that was unnervingly close yet couldn't be located. Leave now. My skin prickled with cold dread. That voice, it was a human. It was low, hollow, and echoed as though it were coming from deep within the walls themselves. My blood ran cold, and I could feel the room closing in on me. Did you hear that? Lacey whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, the lights above us flickered, casting long, spidery shadows on the walls. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to look toward the back of the room. There, standing in the corner, was a figure, a shape barely visible, but there. It was too still, almost unnaturally so. I felt the air around me grow even colder. The whispers grew louder now, and the shape in the corner seemed to shift. It moved slowly, like it was taking its time. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I was rooted to the spot, eyes locked on the figure. I could hear a soft scratching sound now, like fingernails on a chalkboard. But it wasn't coming from the board. It was coming from the figure itself. The closer it got, the more distinct the sounds became, as if it were trying to speak but could only produce a noise like raspy breaths. Suddenly, it was right there, only a few feet away. I froze, not daring to move. My friends were silent too, eyes wide, breathing shallow. The figure didn't have a face. There was only a dark void where its eyes should have been, empty and hollow. Its form was ragged, like it had been torn from the fabric of reality itself. And then, the voice returned, this time right next to me, making my skin crawl. We were here. We were forgotten. The words sent a shiver down my spine, and it felt like something inside me snapped. I knew we needed to leave, but the door was closed. I could have sworn it had been open just a second ago, but now it was shut tight. No one had touched it. Lacey reached for the door, her hands trembling. She pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers had become louder now, filling the room from every direction, surrounding us. The figure that had once been in the corner was now in front of us, moving closer, step by step. One of my friends, Greg, suddenly screamed, and we all spun around. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, staring at the far side of the room. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. There were more figures emerging from the walls. Their faces were like melting shadows, their eyes wide, blank, and endless. Some of them seemed to be reaching out toward us, their arms stretched, their fingers curling like they were grasping at our souls. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears now, pounding louder than anything else. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The cold was suffocating. The room felt like it was closing in, like the walls were shrinking, pressing in on us. Why are they here? What do they want? Lacey gasped, her voice barely a breath. The figure in front of me took one more step forward, and I felt an icy chill wrap around my chest. Its hollow eyes were locked onto mine. Its voice was more than a whisper now. It was a command, a deep, rumbling growl that made my blood run cold. We were forgotten. You will remember. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat louder than the last, like it might burst through my ribs. The cold in the room was unbearable now, a suffocating frost that seemed to wrap around my bones. Every breath felt like ice in my lungs, and my hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for the door again. It wouldn't open. It was like the door itself had become a part of the walls, locked by some unseen force. My vision began to blur. The shadows around me seemed to move, to stretch toward us, their fingers elongating, trying to touch us. Why won't it open? Lacey screamed, panic rising in her voice as she tugged at the handle again. But no matter how hard she pulled, it refused to budge. The figures were moving closer now, too close, their empty eyes staring, their mouths opening wider with every step, but no words came out, just that awful, hollow silence. And then, just as I thought we were trapped forever, something changed. One of the figures, the one that had been closest to me, stepped forward, slowly, reluctantly. It raised its hand, and I could see the thin, bony fingers with nails like claws. There was a sound like a distant moan as the figure stretched its arm toward me. Its mouth opened, and for the first time, I heard it speak in a voice that was so distorted, it sounded like 1,000 voices groaning in unison. You took our place. You must stay. The words echoed in my mind, reverberating inside my skull. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were frozen in place. I couldn't move. My body wouldn't obey. The figure's hand was just inches from my face, and I could see its eyes now, black pits swirling like endless voids. And in them, I saw something terrible. I saw the faces of the students who had vanished all those years ago. Their eyes were wide with fear, their mouths open as if they were trying to scream, but no sound came. Their faces were frozen in agony, twisted in time. The horror of their fates was clear. They were trapped here, in the walls, in the shadows. Trapped like us. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. My mind flooded with visions of the students, their cries for help. They had become part of the curse, part of the classroom. And the worst part was, the longer we stayed, the more we would become like them. Forgotten, lost, trapped in the walls. I tried to reach for my friends, to pull them away, but it was like the room itself was holding us. The figures grew closer. I could hear their whispers now, louder, all around us, scratching at the edges of my mind, pulling at my thoughts. It was as if they wanted to erase us, to erase everything about us until we were just another part of the room, another piece of forgotten history. And then, just as I thought we were done for, I saw it. A flash of light, a faint glow in the corner of the room where the chalkboard had been. It was barely visible, but it was enough. A way out. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel my feet moving slowly, as though my body was still fighting against me, but I forced myself to walk toward the light. It was like the room was fighting back, pushing against me with every step. "Run!" I screamed, my voice barely a whisper. Greg and Lacey snapped out of their trance. They were both staring, their faces pale with fear, but I saw them start to move. We all stumbled toward the glowing light, our legs shaking, our breaths ragged. The figures in the room screamed, their voices rising into a cacophony of sound that rattled the walls. The closer we got to the light, the louder the screams became. Finally, just as one of the figures lunged toward us, I reached the light. I felt a sharp tug at my chest, like something was trying to pull me back, but I didn't stop. I forced myself forward, and in an instant, I was through. We were out. I found myself standing in the hallway, gasping for breath. The door to room 304 slammed shut behind us, the muffled screams and whispers fading as the light flickered and died. We were out, but we knew it wasn't over. We didn't speak as we stumbled away from the cursed classroom, our hearts still racing. There was something different about the air now, something heavy, something that hadn't been there before. I could still hear the faint whispers in my mind, like the figures from the room were still watching us, following us. We hadn't just escaped. We had taken something with us. A part of them, a part of the curse, was now with us. It was in the air we breathed, in the shadows that followed us. And as we walked away, I swore I could hear it. A soft, distant whisper. "Remember us?" The Phantom Teacher. It was the beginning of my junior year at Ridgemont High, and I had a strange feeling about the place that I couldn't shake. The old school building had its charm, but there was something almost haunting about it. The walls were worn, and the faded lockers lined the hallways, their paint chipped and peeling like they were too tired to hold the memories of students long gone. Ridgemont had been around for generations, and that history was almost tangible, as if it had soaked into every inch of the building. Some might say it had character. I'd call it something else, an unsettling presence that never quite let you feel at ease. But even more than the school's eerie architecture, something about my new history teacher, Mr. Whitaker, had me feeling uneasy. He was new to Ridgemont, and at first I thought it was just the nerves of starting a new class, but it quickly became clear that something was off. He was a handsome man, well put together, dressed sharply in crisp suits that didn't match the rest of the worn, faded classroom. His dark hair was perfectly combed, and his eyes, piercing and sharp, seemed to watch every student with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. What really struck me as odd, though, was the way he seemed to know so much about the school's past, too much, as if he'd been there for decades. He spoke with a sort of reverence about the school's history, about the alumni, about the events that had taken place long before any of us had arrived. But there was something else behind his words, an almost obsessive need to relive the past, to draw connections between what was present and what had long been forgotten. I didn't know it yet, but his obsession would soon be our undoing. The first few weeks of class passed like any other. Mr. Whitaker's lessons were compelling, his voice smooth, his stories rich with detail. But the more I listened, the more something felt wrong. The air in the classroom was always colder than the rest of the school, no matter what time of year it was. The windows were always shut, and the only light came from the flickering fluorescent bulbs above. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the corners of the room. It wasn't just me feeling it. There were whispers among my classmates about strange things that happened in his class. Some claimed to hear faint whispers when the room was completely silent. Others said they felt like someone was watching them, even when the class was empty. One day, I noticed something particularly strange. We were having a discussion about local history when Mr. Whitaker mentioned a student from decades ago who had disappeared without a trace. Her name was Jessica Lawson. As he spoke, his eyes grew distant, almost haunted, as if he was reliving some forgotten moment in time. The class fell silent as he continued to recount Jessica's mysterious disappearance, his voice almost trembling. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but when the bell rang and the students started filing out of the room, I noticed that Jessica's seat was still empty. I had seen her there earlier that day, but now she was nowhere to be found. I glanced at the clock. It was past the usual time the bell rang. Maybe she had stayed behind to ask Mr. Whitaker something, I thought. But what happened next would haunt me for the rest of my life. The following day, I walked into Mr. Whitaker's history class, hoping the unsettling events from yesterday were just my imagination getting the better of me. But as soon as I stepped through the door, I felt it. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, suffocating. There was a strange chill in the air, colder than usual, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to shake off the growing feeling of dread that settled in my chest. The students were sitting in their usual seats, but they weren't talking, weren't laughing, weren't sharing the typical banter. Instead, everyone seemed to have a tense silence about them. Even the ones who normally joked around during class had their heads down, their eyes darting nervously from one person to the next. No one would meet my gaze, and I found myself questioning if they could feel it too, the same oppressive weight in the room that I couldn't shake off. I glanced around, trying to make sense of it, but before I could think further, Mr. Whitaker entered the room. He always had this commanding presence, but today, something about him felt even more unsettling. His crisp, dark suit was more immaculate than ever, and his posture was straight as a rod. He walked to the front of the room, his usual cool, confident demeanor in place. But this time his eyes seemed different, darker. His smile, which always seemed welcoming before, now stretched across his face in a way that looked almost forced. "Good morning, class," he said in his smooth voice, but there was an edge to it, something cold beneath the surface, a sharpness that sent a shiver crawling down my spine. Today, we will continue our discussion of Ridgemont's history. There's much more to uncover. The way he said it made my stomach flip. It was as if he wasn't just teaching history. He was living it, like he was trying to bring the past back. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. As he began his lesson, I struggled to focus. His words washed over me, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to Jessica, how she'd disappeared without a trace. Where had she gone? Why had she vanished after yesterday's class? It didn't make sense. And then, as if by some dark force pulling me in, I felt a strange compulsion to look around the room again. I scanned my classmates' faces. Their eyes were glazed over, vacant. They were present in body, but they were mentally somewhere else, lost in a fog that I couldn't penetrate. The classroom seemed like a distant, warped version of itself. The walls, the desks, the flickering fluorescent lights. Everything looked more like a faded dream than reality. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke through the thick silence. The sound of fingers snapping. I looked up, startled, and saw Mr. Whitaker's eyes locked on me. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, as if he knew exactly what I was thinking. A shiver ran through me, and I quickly looked away, heart pounding in my chest. But I couldn't escape the feeling that he was somehow inside my head, that he was watching me far too closely, reading my thoughts. "Don't worry, Laura," Mr. Whitaker said, his voice soft but oddly reassuring. "You'll understand soon enough." My eyes widened. How did he know my name? Of course, I knew he was our teacher, but he'd never singled me out like this before. It was almost as if he had known me for years. The class went on, but I couldn't stop myself from stealing glances at the door, hoping Jessica would walk in, that she was just running late or had been absent for some reason. But the door remained shut, and she never appeared. The longer I sat there, the heavier the air grew, as if something was pushing down on me from all sides. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a faint sound, a whisper so low it could barely be heard, but it felt like it came from inside my own mind. "He's watching." I froze. My pulse quickened, and I looked around the room, but no one seemed to notice. The whispers came again, louder this time. "You're next." I turned quickly to look at the door once more, but this time, something was wrong. There, standing in the corner by the window, was a figure. It was Jessica, or at least it looked like her. Her face was pale, her clothes tattered, as if she had been through something horrible. Her hair hung in tangled strands, and her eyes were wide, dark, empty. For a split second, our eyes met, and I felt an intense wave of fear wash over me. But then, just as quickly, she disappeared. No dramatic vanishing, no flash of light. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, like a fleeting shadow that never existed. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but when I looked again, the corner of the room was empty. Was it real? Had I imagined it? I turned to look at Mr. Whitaker, my heart hammering in my chest. But he was still standing in front of the class, lecturing about Ridgemont's history, his back turned toward me. He hadn't seen anything. No one had. But then, I noticed something I hadn't before. The room was growing darker, and not just from the setting sun outside. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, curling around the walls and windows as if the very room was being swallowed by them. My anxiety grew as the whispers continued, louder now, swirling in my mind. "Get out. He's coming. He's watching." The voices weren't just in my head anymore. They were in the room, echoing from the walls, from the desks, from the space itself. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body felt heavy, sluggish, as though some invisible force was holding me down. And then, suddenly, the door to the classroom slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet, making everyone jump. But as soon as the door closed, the air seemed to freeze. The temperature dropped, and the room became even colder than it had been before. Mr. Whitaker didn't even flinch. In fact, he barely seemed to notice. His gaze was fixed on the chalkboard, and his voice grew deeper, more hypnotic, as if the very rhythm of his words was pulling us deeper into his web. That's when I realized this wasn't just a class. This was a trap, a place where time bled together, where the living and the dead weren't separated by anything but a thin veil. And Mr. Whitaker? He wasn't just a teacher. He was something much older, much darker. His true purpose was more than just teaching history. He was trying to bring the past back, by trapping his students one by one in the same endless loop of time. And as I looked around the room, it hit me. We were all part of it. Every student who had come before me, every soul who had disappeared without explanation, had become part of this cycle. They were stuck in the classroom, just like me, and there was no way out. I tried to move, to run, but I was paralyzed. The whispers in my ears grew louder, and I turned to see her again, Jessica. But she wasn't standing by the door anymore. She was standing right behind me, her hollow eyes staring straight into mine. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, but no sound came out. My blood ran cold as I realized I wasn't just seeing her. I was hearing her, feeling her. She was part of this nightmare now, and so was I. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to break through the very walls of my mind. The sound was no longer a faint murmur. It was a cacophony, 1,000 voices all speaking at once, urging me to leave, escape, run. But my body was frozen, trapped in place as if the very air around me had thickened into a viscous fog that made every movement feel impossible. I turned my head slightly, glancing at the door. It was still shut, the darkness pressing against the windows like an unrelenting tide. I knew that I couldn't get out, not while Mr. Whitaker was still here, not while this nightmare was still alive. I swallowed hard, trying to fight the urge to cry out. I looked back at the class, hoping for some kind of reaction, some sign that I wasn't alone in this. But all my classmates remained eerily still, their eyes glazed over, their bodies frozen in time. They weren't even blinking. They were just there, like mannequins, lifeless puppets controlled by some unseen force. And then my gaze drifted back to Mr. Whitaker. He was standing by the chalkboard, his back to me. His chalk was moving on its own, writing on the board in sharp, jagged strokes. The words that appeared were not from the lesson, but something darker, something that made my blood run cold. Welcome to eternity. I blinked rapidly, hoping I had misread it, but the words remained. The message was clear now. This was no ordinary classroom. This was a prison. A twisted, supernatural trap designed to keep us here forever, to trap our souls in the never-ending cycle of Mr. Whitaker's cursed lessons. And I was no longer just a student, I was a victim. A cold, clammy hand brushed against my shoulder, sending a jolt of terror through my body. I whipped around, heart pounding in my chest, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I could feel the hairs on my neck standing up, a gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach, as though something was watching me. No, staring at me, its eyes boring into my very soul. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her again. Jessica. She was standing just behind me, her pale face twisted in anguish, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words caught in my throat. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She reached out toward me, her fingers stretching like something unnatural, something wrong, and I took an instinctual step back. But there was nowhere to go. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then the whispers returned, more urgent this time. They were no longer just warnings, they were commands. You must stay. He's waiting for you. I tried to cover my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head now, filling every corner of my mind, pushing me deeper into the nightmare. I was drowning in the sound, in the terror. Jessica's eyes, those dead, empty eyes, seemed to grow even larger, her figure becoming more defined, more real. Her lips curled into a grin that made my skin crawl. It was a smile full of pain, full of something darker than I could comprehend. She wasn't just a ghost. She was trapped, just like all of us, trapped in the hell of this room, with no escape, no end. My legs shook violently, but I couldn't stop myself from reaching out to her. I couldn't leave her behind, couldn't leave any of them behind. They were lost, just like me. And then it hit me. This wasn't a classroom. It was a realm, a twisted prison outside of time, where Mr. Whitaker had taken countless students over the years, one by one, and forced them to relive his cursed history lessons. The truth was darker than I had ever imagined. He wasn't just a teacher. He was something far older, far more dangerous. He was feeding off our fear. Before I could process what was happening, the room shifted. The walls around me began to bend and ripple, like they were made of something fluid, something alive. the blackboard's writing twisted and distorted until the words no longer made sense. And then I saw them, the others. Their faces appeared in the shadows, pale and ghostly, flickering like half-formed memories. They reached out with skeletal hands, their expressions twisted in eternal torment. Each one was a student who had vanished over the years, their souls now trapped in the same prison I was in. They were forever bound to Mr. Whitaker's curse. And now, I was one of them. In a panic, I stumbled back, knocking my chair to the ground with a loud crash. The other students, no, the other ghosts, shifted in their seats, their empty eyes slowly turning toward me. Mr. Whitaker finally turned around. His eyes met mine, and I saw something that made my heart stop. Recognition. He smiled, a smile that wasn't just cold, but malevolent, as though he had been waiting for this moment for years. His voice, low and gravelly, filled the room. "Welcome, Laura," he said softly, almost pityingly. "I've been waiting for you." Before I could react, he lifted his hand, and the door to the classroom opened. But it wasn't an escape. It was a portal, a dark, swirling vortex that beckoned me forward. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the threshold. I didn't have a choice. With one final glance at the classroom, at the faces of all the souls that had been lost before me, I stepped into the darkness. And then nothing. The abandoned gymnasium. It was one of those stories you'd hear whispered in the halls between classes, told to students who had nothing better to do than to scare each other. At first, I thought it was just another one of those urban legends. You know, the kind that doesn't have much weight to it. Just rumors floating around, meant to be forgotten by the end of the day. But when I found myself standing in front of the old, rusting doors of the abandoned gymnasium, I realized there was a lot more truth to the stories than I ever thought possible. The gym had been closed off for years, ever since the accident. No one talked about what happened. Not really. Teachers avoided it. Students steered clear of it. But whenever the school was quiet, usually on weekends or during the holidays, there would always be that one dare. You know, the one where someone would bet you to walk inside for a few minutes, just to see if you could. That's exactly how I ended up here, standing in front of the old gym with a pounding heart, a flashlight in my hand, and the faint echoes of daredevil laughter in the background. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt something shift. The air felt colder inside than it had outside. It was as though the gym was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The faint sounds of my footsteps were drowned out by the unsettling silence that clung to the place like a thick fog. I could hear the hum of old lights above, flickering as if they hadn't been used in years. I took a deep breath and stepped deeper inside, the wood of the floor creaking beneath me. The gymnasium was large, its basketball hoops hanging from the ceiling like forgotten relics. The bleachers were rusted and abandoned, their seats warped and broken. But it wasn't the state of the gym that unnerved me. It was the feeling, the presence that seemed to haunt the space. There were rumors that students had gone missing after spending too much time inside. Others said they heard strange noises, like whispers or distant screams, echoing through the empty gym at night. But I was determined to prove it was all nonsense. The door behind me slammed shut with an ominous sound, and I froze. The air had gotten heavier. I wasn't alone. The temperature in the gym dropped, and I felt a chill settle over me, one that sank deep into my bones. My flashlight flickered, casting weak, dancing shadows on the peeling walls. I turned it up to full brightness, trying to see further into the darkness of the gym's corners. That's when I heard it, a creak, the sound of old wood under weight, like footsteps from far away. My heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly, expecting to see a person, another daredevil who'd followed me in. But the gym was still empty, save for the endless rows of broken bleachers and old equipment. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. There was no reason to panic. I was just hearing things, right? Then I heard it again. This time, it was closer, Step, step. I spun around, flashlight in hand, aiming it at the far side of the gym. My breath was shallow, and I was sure my heart was about to burst out of my chest. Nothing. I began to feel a growing sense of unease, like something was in the air, just out of reach. I walked a few steps forward, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, but the strange sensation didn't leave. I was being followed. I heard the footsteps again, and this time, they were unmistakable, a deliberate, slow rhythm that matched my own. I spun around, this time shining the flashlight behind me. There, standing in the doorway at the far end of the gym, was a figure. A man, or what looked like a man, standing perfectly still, his back turned toward me. He was wearing a faded gym uniform, his clothes old and tattered. But the most unsettling thing was his head, his face. It was pale, and his eyes were hidden in shadow, but I could swear I saw them glinting in the darkness. I stood frozen, my legs refusing to move. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to acknowledge my presence. It was as if he was waiting for something. Then, the floor beneath me groaned, louder this time, and I could hear something else, the sound of soft whispers rising from the shadows. Get out, leave. The whispers were growing louder, but I couldn't move. I could feel an icy breath on the back of my neck, as if the figure was right behind me. I turned quickly, my flashlight illuminating the space in front of me, but I saw no one. The gym was empty again. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, and all I could hear was my own frantic breathing, echoing through the empty gym. Then, something caught my eye, a piece of paper on the floor, partially hidden under one of the old bleachers. I approached it hesitantly, my hands trembling. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, and it read, "Another student goes missing. Last seen entering the abandoned gym." The hairs on my neck stood on end. The date on the paper was years ago, long before I was ever a student here. That's when I realized the rumors were true. Something in this gym was trapping people, keeping them here. I had to leave. I turned quickly, my body now on full alert. The gym, once seemingly vast and endless, now felt like a maze, a place where I might never find my way out. But as I walked towards the door, I heard it again, the footsteps. They were right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just empty air. But the sensation of being watched, of being hunted, was unbearable. I reached the door, pulling on the handle with all my strength. It didn't budge. The door was locked. Panic rose in my chest, and I began to bang on the door, screaming for help, but no one came. That's when I heard the soft laughter echoing through the gymnasium. It wasn't a human laugh. It was a dark, hollow sound that seemed to reverberate from the very walls, from the shadows themselves. The figure from earlier appeared again, this time standing right in front of me. His eyes glinted, now visible, glowing faintly in the darkness. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his voice like ice. I turned to run, but the gym had changed. The once familiar space had become a maze of dark corridors, each one leading deeper into the abyss. The lights flickered and buzzed, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. I couldn't find the exit. The laughter grew louder, more maniacal. I ran, faster and faster, my heart pounding in my chest, but it was useless. The gym had become its own trap, and there was no way out. No one had ever left the abandoned gymnasium, and now I wouldn't either. Thank you all for watching. I request you to like the video, subscribe for more scary stories. On that